Millions of Brazilians with their families have been taking the front of the army barracks all across the country to protest the election of Lula over mounting evidence of fraud. Dear gringo friends from abroad, may I please have your attention for what's happening here in Brazil. This is very serious and needs to be communicated to the world. Our democracy is being destroyed and left in shambles in broad daylight by tyrants, not only treasonous domestic criminals, but, on top of that, influenced and instigated from abroad by powerful, nationless international groups. I mean to be very succinct, since the subject is quite broad and has a chronology that extends for at least the last 20 years. So, going straight to the point, our electronic voting boxes, in which we place our, quote, democratic faith, unquote, are called first-generation systems, dating back to 1996, imported from Venezuela's Smartmatic, where the extreme left has been winning elections, so to speak, for over 20 years and where 80% of the population are starving. Yes, you heard that right. Our democracy is deposited in a technology, literally from the last century, which the narco-terrorists of Venezuela have been using to perpetuate themselves in power. As if that were not enough, such boxes do not print proof of our vote. That is, voters are left at the mercy of a program which we have no idea how it works. It's not subject to any audits, but they are declared sacrosanct and the last wonder of the universe by a roster of unvoted-for electoral judges and other bureaucrats closely connected to Lula and the extreme left Workers' Party and his comrades. Who could have imagined that, right? To give you an idea of how dire the situation is here in Brazil, I'll invite you over to a little journey of scandals involving judges, bureaucrats, and other agents of disinformation, propaganda, and fraud in our electoral process. Sit back and enjoy it. But before cutting to chase, my apologies for a misstep here. In Brazil, our authorities created a new jurisprudence to criminalize criticism either of institutions or of themselves, the supreme authorities of the nation, tearing up the constitution and demeaning our legal system. So, if this video becomes relevant on the internet, I might very likely integrate an illegal and unconstitutional inquiry opened by the Justice of the Brazilian Supreme Court, Alexandre de Moraes, who criminalizes critical opinions, creating a new criminal classification which is reminiscent of a court of the Third Reich, called fake news crime, attack on democratic institutions, and on the democratic rule of law. Well, so that you understand the thread in which the facts unfold, I will divide this message into acts, aiming at a better organization and understanding. First, let's focus on the voting machines and the successive and unbelievable violations of their system. Act 1, November 2018. Hacker invasion of the source code of the electronic voting machines. In November 2018, a Brazilian hacker named Marcos Roberto Correia da Silva communicated via email to the editor of the Tecmundo website that he had invaded and violated the electronic voting system of the Superior Electoral Court of Brazil. Based on the revelation made by the hacker to the editor of the aforementioned website, the Superior Electoral Court of Brazil officiated to the Brazilian Federal Police to open an investigation into the case. Following that, the Federal Police Chief opened an inquiry and sought out the TSE to make a series of inquiries to that electoral court. In response, the TSE prepared a report and delivered it to the Federal Police. In it, the TSE confirms everything that the hacker had communicated to the referred site and even adds some disturbing details. First, however, let's pay attention to the hacker's email that originated the subsequent investigations. Quote, Due to flaws and vulnerabilities in applications developed by the TSE, I ended up obtaining remote access to one of the network's equipment. This way, I had access to the internal network, intranet, and for several months, I was exploring the network, including entering several different machines of the TSE in search of understanding the functioning of the voting system. With that, I obtained thousands of source codes, confidential documents, and even credentials, including the logging of a TSE deputy minister and several technicians, some linked to the top information technology leadership of the TSE. Unquote. Act 2. Superior Electoral Court admits invasion of the voting system, including its source code. Now, guys, let's go and see what the TSE itself declared in a report delivered in response to the Federal Police inquiry. Quote, the user base may have been compromised and the attacker is cracking passwords for later use. The attacker describes having access to the internal network for several months, logging into several machines. This report is consistent with what was observed in April 2018. Unquote. Here in this excerpt from the report, the TSE corroborates the statements made by the hacker and admits to having suffered an attack in the heart of its system. The TSE also confirms the use by the hacker of the passwords of the court's own infrastructure coordinator to invade the voting system. Hang on to your chair now, guys, because even more disturbing facts are yet to come to light. The TSE also states in its report that the hacker invaded a part of the software where the computerized section portal and the source code of the electronic voting machines are located. The signatory of the report is the TSE IT substitute technician, who states, quote, these equipment were responsible for compiling the software in its Linux version and Windows version. Running on this equipment was the Jenks, configured by the Savin team itself, without any authentication. Yes, you guys got that right. The part of the software where the source code is found was, quote, without any authentication, unquote. As if that weren't enough, the report's signatory goes further and makes another bombastic revelation. Quote, this server was accessible to the entire network and allowed copying of all source code. Unquote. Okay, my dear gringo friends, just look at what happened. Between April and November 2018, an election year in Brazil, a hacker invaded the electronic voting machine system, navigated freely inside it until he reached its heart, that is, the source code. Any IT professional knows what the implications are of violating the source code and how much this represents in terms of vulnerability and security of a computerized system. Act 3. TSE loses the logs requested by the Federal Police Chief who opened the inquiry. Now, folks, you see, to add one more element to the list of absurdities, when the Federal Police asked the TSE for the log files where crucial information is recorded, such as usage histories as well as input and output of the software, the same TSE employee who had his password stolen by the hacker responds as follows, quote, due to maintenance work to solve blockages in the TSE firewalls, the global IP team reinstalled the management service, not taking due care not to harm the stored logs. Thus, we inform you that the TSE does not have additional data to pass on to the Federal Police. Unquote. As a result, the Federal Police was unable to verify whether or not the hacker altered the internal data of the TSE voting system, especially those contained in the heart of the machine, that is, its source code. Here, I politely ask you guys on whether we can call this justice and whether it is possible to have some remnant of democracy in a country whose highest electoral court, whose very existence by itself is already questionable, acts in an amateurish, irresponsible, negligent, and criminal way, with very little or no accountability. Act 4. Scandal of invasion of the TSE system comes to light, generating strong reaction from different sectors of society. As investigation by the federal police regarding the invasion of the voting system was not under judicial secrecy, public authorities and the press obtained access to it and transmitted its content to the public. Such appalling facts generated perplexity and indignation among the population, which resulted in political movement, debates in the press and on social media with the aim of debating the alteration of the Brazilian voting system in the sense of instituting the model of printed and auditable voting, as occurs in the overwhelming majority of democratic countries, thus bringing an additional layer of electoral transparency. With that, President Bolsonaro, together with his allied based in Congress and with the votes of centrist parliamentarians, approved a parliamentarian commission to advance the proposal of the auditable printed vote in that house to turn it into a constitutional amendment. Act 5. Immediate reaction of the system. Minister of the Supreme Court intervenes in a parliamentary committee. Now, dear friends, see how the Brazilian corruption mechanism reacted to the possibility of our voting system becoming safe and transparent through the auditable printed vote. One of the ministers of the Supreme Court of Brazil, Mr. Luiz Roberto Barroso, crossed the Praça dos Três Poderes in Brasília to dissuade the parliamentary members of that commission that would take the proposal to implement the printed voting system to the plenary. In short, Barroso used his power of blackmail to pressure the commission, which then replaced all the parliamentarians in favor of the proposal of the printed vote and put in their place leftist parliamentarians against it. Thus, in an anti-democratic coup by Mr. Barroso, died there on August 10, 2021, the proposal to improve our voting system and our democracy, which went defeated in the plenary of that legislative house. 2 months earlier, in June, walking through the corridors of the House of Deputies, Mr. Barroso was caught making the following statement to some people around him with whom he was having a relaxed conversation. Quote, "I usually joke that an election is not won, it's taken." Unquote. Soon after, with an air of some embarrassment, he asks one of his interlocutors / comrades, quote, "Is the sound on?" Unquote. Now, I ask for 2 minutes of your attention for a brief history of Mr. Luiz Roberto Barroso. Despite being a notable Brazilian constitutionalist lawyer, Minister Barroso has some disturbing facts in his biography, such as the following. A confessed Marxist, Barroso is a close friend of the famous Brazilian mystic healer João de Deus, convicted by a Brazilian federal court for abusing hundreds of women. Barroso once said the following about the criminal, quote, "What I can say is that there is something totally transcendent in the power that he has to exhale good, to heal people, and to get the best from them." Unquote. In addition, Barroso advocated for the Italian Marxist terrorist and confessed murderer Cesare Battisti, a fugitive in Brazil during the Lula and Dilma governments, and extradited back to Italy in 2019 in the first year of Bolsonaro's term. In one of his statements about Battisti, Barroso stated, quote, "Cesare looks me in the eye and says, 'I didn't take part in any of those homicides. I believe what he tells me.'" Unquote. Upon arriving in Italy, extradited by the Bolsonaro government, Battisti confessed to murdering 4 innocents and was sentenced to life imprisonment. To crown the icing on the cake of this short biography of Mr. Barroso, this non-elected bureaucrat was nominated as a minister of our Supreme Court by the worst president in the history of Brazil, the former communist terrorist who blew up banks and plotted the murder of political enemies among her guerrilla comrades between the 1970s and 1980s, Mrs. Dilma van der Rousseff, successor of the multi-millionaire populist commie and bon vivant Lula da Silva, the head of the biggest corruption scheme in the entire history of modern democracies, in addition to being a confessed friend of narco-dictators such as Nicolás Maduro from Venezuela, Daniel Ortega from Nicaragua, Gustavo Petro from Colombia, the Castro family from Cuba, and having close, albeit barely disguised, relations with national and international narco-terrorist groups such as Brazilian PCC and CV, the Soles Cartel from Venezuela, FARC from Colombia, and, of course, the narco-communist organization Foro de São Paulo, founded in 1990 by nobody less than Fidel Castro and Lula himself, as a response of local communists taking direct orders from Moscow in the wake of the tearing down of the Berlin Wall and the fall of the USSR. This undue interference, however, in the legislative and executive powers by the powerful justice of the Federal Supreme Court, Mr. Barroso, wasn't ignored at all. Act 5. President Bolsonaro reacts strongly to Barroso's interference in the executive and legislative powers. In November 2021, through a live on YouTube for Brazil's most viewed political program, Pingos nos Is, by the journalistic company Jovem Pan, President Bolsonaro and Federal Deputy Felipe Barros brought to light the appalling information and conclusions contained in the Federal Police investigation and in the TSE report, and pointed to Mr. Barroso's criminal interference to overthrow the auditable printed vote proposal in the House of Deputies Committee. Not satisfied, though, with the pitiful episode perpetrated by Mr. Barroso, President Bolsonaro strongly criticized him, calling him a liar and refusing to abandon the idea to improve our electoral system. Act 6. Stalemate between the Presidency of the Republic and the TSE results in an invitation to the armed forces. Thus, in view of the stalemate between President Bolsonaro and the superior electoral and Supreme Federal Courts regarding the implementation of the printed vote in Brazil, replacing the current system, the TSE, in the figure of its then president, Mr. Luiz Barroso, made a small concession to the Brazilian armed forces, inviting them on August 31, 2021, to join the so-called Commission for Transparency of the Electoral Process. Such an invitation, readily accepted by our armed forces, unfortunately, however, did not have the strength to implement the desired changes regarding the auditable printed vote. However, once the invitation was accepted, the military members of the Commission became a thorn in the side of the non-elected TSE bureaucrats by proposing improvements to the current system. Act 7. Armed Forces specialists have their access restricted and controlled by the TSE to the voting system. The armed forces, through their top-notch cybersecurity technicians, presented suggestions to the TSE that addressed 7 topics. Of these, only 3 were accepted by the TSE, as follows: the security level tests at the ballot boxes, the inspection test, and the public security test. On the other hand, the Ministry of Defense classified the confidence level of the integrity test as, quote, low, unquote, and suggested 2 types of samples for state and federal elections, to which the TSE limited itself to saying that it increased the number of ballot samples for 2022, but without any proof, responsibility, or respect to the Brazilian people. The TSE stated, astonishingly, that, quote, the margin of confidence in the process is greater than 99%, unquote. Act 8. Brazil moves towards its Democratic Party / make-believe play under the aegis of distrust. So, with our democracy in tatters, we went to the election on last October 3rd this year, and for the second round on October 30th. Act 9. Lula's victory in the first round / graphic pattern of the voting calculation draws attention. In the first round, on the 3rd of October, Lula da Silva won with 48.43% of the vote against 43.2% of the second place, Bolsonaro. Now, just out of curiosity, regardless of whether or not you are the IT guy who works with statistical data, stop for a moment and analyze the graphic design of the vote count. Here it is. In case you're not a layman on the subject, is such a graphic pattern plausible? Act 10. Lula declared winner of the election by a narrow margin. Weird score chart pattern repeats. Well, moving on. Second round, October 30th. Lula da Silva is proclaimed the winner with 50.9% of the valid votes against 49.1% for Bolsonaro. Look again at the graphic design of the vote count. Did you notice any pattern? For those of you who work with IT, is this normal and statistically plausible? The bomb, however, came after the end of the electoral process. Act 11. Armed Forces released disturbing report on serious failures and inconsistencies during the process of monitoring the voting system. Millions of Brazilians take the front of the barracks in protest, crying out to the armed forces for the annulment of the election. Truck drivers carry out a general stoppage of highways across the country. On November 9, 2022, the armed forces released to the press and the general public a report with bombastic revelations about the recently concluded electoral process, where they categorically state the impossibility of attesting to the inviolability of electronic voting machines and the integrity of its system. At the end of the report, the armed forces affirmed the need to have access to the source codes of the voting machines in order to verify the possibility that they have suffered some type of external interference. However, until the present moment, the Supreme Electoral Court has refused to provide our armed forces with access to the source codes, endorsing the alleged supremacy of the 1996 electronic boxes of the Venezuelan company Smartmatic. Now, dear folks, enjoy a summary of the conclusions of the report prepared by the Armed Forces Inspection and Audit Team of the electronic voting system, which was delivered to the TSE, consigned and countersigned by Mr. Paulo Sérgio Nogueira de Oliveira, Minister of State for Defense, and signed by the following officers of the three forces: Colonel Marcelo Nogueira de Souza, Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces and representative of the Army; Colonel Aviator Wagner Oliveira da Silva, Deputy Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces and representative of the Air Force; and Marcos Roger Cavalcante Andrade, member of the Armed Forces Team and representative of the Navy. Quote, conclusion. However, despite the intention to provide transparency to the process, the tools and procedures made available by the TSE technical team for the work of the supervisory bodies were not sufficient for a more complete technical analysis. The stipulated conditions, both in the source code inspection and during the compilation of the software, made it difficult to search for possible vulnerabilities in the electronic voting system. The static analysis of a code of more than 17 million lines, combined with the lack of information on the security conditions of the network used to store the compilation library repositories, limited the scope and effectiveness of the inspection procedure carried out by the Forces Team Inspection and Audit of the electronic voting system. The non-availability of version control is highlighted as an important gap in the inspection of source codes. This does not allow us to ensure that the code present on the ballot boxes on voting day corresponds exactly to what was verified by the team. Unquote. That is, if a SEV, which is the Armed Forces Technical Supervisory Body, categorically states that it was unable to carry out a satisfactory inspection work at key points in the process, such as inspection of source codes, software compilation, information on network security conditions, etc. Dear friends, look, this is very serious. In any decent democracy, such absurdities would have given rise to the almost immediate annulment of the election and the consequent imprisonment of those involved. An electoral process that's supervised in a limited, partial way, controlled by the non-elected bureaucrats of the TSE, with flagrant disrespect and contempt for the highly qualified IT security team of the armed forces. Act 12. The Federal Supreme Court and the Superior Electoral Court start a witch hunt, threatening to arrest protesters, apply millionaire fines to truck drivers on strike on the roads, take down profiles on social networks to silence parliamentarians, journalists, businessmen, influencers, and whoever dares call into question the integrity of the electoral process, violating human rights, trampling upon due process of law and our Constitution. At this moment, when I address you, the Brazilian Superior Electoral Court is tearing up our constitutional order as well as its legal system, opening unconstitutional inquiries, silencing and censoring voices, taking down accounts of parliamentarians, journalists, business people, and influencers on social networks, doing prior censorship, demonetizing and taking down channels on YouTube, threatening people with prison for the non-existent crime of fake news. In short, carrying out a real witch hunt against anyone who dares to question and oppose the way in which the electoral process that gave Lula victory was conducted. Even Brazil's most voted congresswoman, with 946,244 votes, Carla Zambelli, had all her accounts on social media platforms shut down by unconstitutional orders issued by the TSE. Fearing an arrest warrant would be issued on her because of her contestation of the electoral process that gave Lula the victory, she recently fled to the United States and filed, together with Brazilian journalist Paulo Figueiredo, a human rights violation complaint with the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights in Washington, D.C. In short, the Brazilian legal system has been cancelled, as well as its constitution and democracy, precisely by those who should protect them. And what's worse, all this happens with the complacency of almost 100% of our old mainstream media that abandoned objective journalism long ago to preach ideology and leftist militants daily on their programs, and therefore see their ratings tumbling over the last years. It may also have to do with the fact that they've lost billions of reais of state-funded advertisements, so common under the leftist governments of yore. Finally, I wanna make a special plea to you, my dear gringo friend from abroad, who had the kind consideration and patience to stick with me until this point on the video. Please share this message and take it to as many people as possible so that the world knows what's actually happening in Brazil. We've been peacefully protesting for 20 non-stop days in front of barracks by the millions all across this huge and beautiful country, and even abroad in ever-increasing numbers, asking our armed forces to enforce what they requested in their report and let us know if there was, in fact, manipulation and outside interference in our electoral process. Contrary to the narrative sold to an ever more diminishing audience by our old corrupt press, closely connected with the national and international left wing, we are not coup plotters. We are only calling on our armed forces to fulfill their constitutional and institutional role of definitively ascertaining whether or not our electoral process has been defrauded and assert their authority to request access to the source code of the electronic voting machines. We, the patriotic, law-abiding, working people of this country, only want to claim our right to be able to lose, if so be it, an election within a democracy. and not lose our democracy within an election. Thank you so much, guys, for staying with me through the end of this video. I really appreciate your patience, consideration, and your viewership as well. May God stay with you and bless your life. Take good care of yourself. Bye bye.